So Sherry and I are here together to resume after an unfortunately long hiatus, our series on meditations on the tarot. I didn't really mean to be for the gap between installments to be that long, but I was in the middle of moving, and then there were family events that intervene. I had a gout flare up one of the weekends, so a combination of like me moving,
Life.
family commitments, and an unfortunate gout flare up
Yeah.
kept us from recording when we'd wanted to. So, but we're finally back on track. And it's just Sherry and I today, but I think I'm not too concerned about that. I think we'll do a perfectly fine job. And so we're here to talk about letter 10, which is the Wheel of Fortune, which is the letter on the Wheel of Fortune.
Yeah.
And I'll go ahead and kind of, rather than talk, I'll actually just share the image on the card, and then we can kind of talk about what Tomberg says about the imagery
Okay.
early in the chapter. And so that's can you see that, Sherry?
It
So
just says, oh, there it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
I see.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's the image on the card. So we have a monkey that is descending and a dog that is ascending on the wheel, and then above them is the figure of the Sphinx.
And he makes a note, interestingly enough, that the monkey's head is up.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that his descent is not willing.
Yeah. Yeah. He doesn't look too happy, does he?
Right. He doesn't look too happy. Yeah, right. Exactly. Okay.
That's nice to see that actually in color.
Yeah. So that's the image. Okay. Or of the version of the card that he's commenting on, like the medieval French version, like quite specifically.
Isn't it the rider?
Like there are lots of different versions of the tarot, but Tomberg is quite specifically limiting himself to the medieval French version of the tarot in terms of what he's talking about in his reflections on the meaning of the symbolism of the imagery on the cards. Yeah. So do you want to dive into what he said? Like, let's talk about just like what he observes about like the meaning of the.
You want me to read it? The first paragraph here?
Sure, go for it.
Okay. Dear unknown friend, we have before us a wheel which rotates, and three figures in animal form, of which two, the monkey and the dog, turn with the wheel, whilst the third, the Sphinx, is beyond the movement of the wheel. He is seated on a platform above the wheel. The monkey descends in order to rise again. The dog rises in order to descend again. First one and then the other pass before the Sphinx. Simple and natural questions which arise spontaneously when one looks at the card are: why do the monkey and the dog turn with the wheel? Why is the Sphinx there? How many times will the monkey and the dog pass before the Sphinx? And why are there these meetings with the Sphinx? Once having posed these simple questions, we find ourselves already at the heart of the 10th arcanum, plunged into the very sphere of notions and ideas which it is called to awaken. In fact, the wheel alone, without its two passengers and without the Sphinx seated above it, evokes only the idea of a circle, or at most that of circular movement. The wheel with the two animals, the one rising and the other descending, without the Sphinx above it, evokes the idea of a vain and absurd game. But the wheel turning with its two passengers and the Sphinx dominating the whole makes the onlooker ask himself if this is not an arcanum, i.e., a key that one has to know in order to be able to orient oneself, in this case, in the domain of problems and phenomena relating to the circular movement of living beings. It is especially the Sphinx above the wheel which gives us an intellectual shock and which impels us to seek out the arcanum of this card. Yeah. So where do you want to start, Nate?
Well, let's start. Well, we could start with saying what he says about the figures, right? Yeah. So the monkey represents the principle of the fall or involution. and the dog represents the ascent or evolution.
Right.
So that because of their opposing motion, they're basically they're moving in the opposite direction. So the dog is rising up and descending toward the Sphinx, and the monkey is falling down, descending away from the Sphinx. And he relates the Sphinx to the Sphinx is related to his concept of like the divine, I don't know, I want to say the divine. Yeah, the divine prototype
Yeah.
of all
Yeah.
creation.
It reminded me, wasn't there, I couldn't remember where it was, but in Revelation, the Apocalypse of St. John by Emil Boek, he talks about that too, about humans and animals having been integrated.
Right. And
Right.
this is a right. And that's the idea of a divine prototype is pretty of creation, that it like that exists before the creation is fairly common. Like if you like I don't know if you saw I don't know if it was in the part that I played in my talk with Michael yesterday, but Jordan Daniel Wood in that
I watched that. I watched his
in that
talk.
talk about Maximus, he talks about how for Maximus, like the fall and the moment of creation happen simultaneously. So that means that like Adam as an image of God exists as a prototype
I like that.
before.
Yeah. I would have, I see the same thing, but I would have phrased it as the fall would have been implied in that the creation was the beginning of redemption.
Well, this makes it clear. The thing here is that, right? Yes. And this makes it clear in what precise way that Christ is the second Adam, right? It's the restoration of the prototype after the fall and the move toward redemption and restoration, which clearly for Talberg in this chapter is a totalizing apokatastasis for Talberg.
Yes.
Without a doubt.
Yeah. Could you think about it instead of a restoration as a reintegration, or like a process? This is really totally a process of becoming, right?
Right. Yeah.
This is how it's done.
He calls it a metamorphosis at one point.
Does he?
Yeah, like fairly late in the chapter.
Okay.
I can.
Well, let's just start with the beginning stuff because it's so good.
Sure. Let's just go through. Yeah, if you can kind of jump in like anywhere that you want, like that you thought was salient that you want to share, go for it.
Well, just in regards to that, he says the card of the 10th Arcanum therefore teaches through its actual context an organism of ideas relating to the problem of the fall and the reintegration. It portrays the whole circle, including ascent as well as descent, whilst the transformism of modern science is occupied with only half the circle, namely the half of ascent or evolution. The fact is that certain eminent scientists such as Edgar Dacqué in Germany and Pierre, I can't say his name.
Teilhard de Chardin.
Okay, in France, advanced the postulate of the pre-existence, be it only potentially, of a prototype for all beings, which is the ultimate as well as the effective cause of the whole process of evolution. And this postulate alone renders evolution intelligible.
This idea of a prototype, by the way, that he says that he attributes to Dacqué and Desjardins, that's not really like, that's well established. That kind of thinking is well established within patristic writings and also within a lot of like Jewish esotericism as well.
I was unaware of that. I wonder, the first thing that pops in my mind when I hear you say that is, if it's that deeply rooted, this idea of a prototype, it would be archetypal in our consciousness, and out of that archetype could grow the ideas that Darwin actually pursued,
Mhm,
right?
mhm.
Because he has this notion that that out of this prototype comes everything, and then he moves forward to prove that.
Well, but
I don't know how
but
conscious he
evolution
was of that.
doesn't. Evolution only looks at it from the emergent, right? From the emergent direction. So that's
Right.
why it's like it's incomplete. And actually, Tom Berg says it's unintelligible.
Yeah, I know it right here. I want to read that because I
Okay.
loved it. This basic scientific presupposition renders evolution unintelligible because it disregards half the circle, namely all that which precedes, be it only in ordine cognoscendi, the state of primitivity from which science takes its point of departure. Because one has to renounce thought and reduce it to lethargy in order to be able to sincerely believe that man evolved from the primitive and unconscious particles of a primordial mist, which was once our planet, without this mist bearing within itself the seed of all possibilities for future evolution, which is the process of eclosion, i.e. the process of transition from a potential state to an actual state. Yeah, so
That's becoming right there.
yes, yeah,
The
that's the
movement from a
process of
potential
eclosion.
state to an actual state.
And this is what the process of eclosion is, or is the becoming process?
No, I was referring to not the eclosion, but to the part after that.
Right, okay,
Yeah.
yeah. But then he says down below, metaphysical brocade or not, it does not matter. The fact of the unintelligibility for human thought of the theory, and then in brackets he has not the facts, exclamation mark, of evolution, advanced by science, nevertheless remains a fact. So
So what he's saying is he accepts the fact.
he accepts the fact, but not the theory.
Correct.
Yeah.
Because the theory, as stated, is incomplete.
Yes.
Because it only has assent.
Right. It refuses, he says here, to accept the other
And
half
emergence.
of the circle, that of involution or the fall, which would make it
Correct.
intelligible.
Yeah,
Which
exactly.
is
so it's evading half of the picture.
the gloomy side, Nate.
The part that we talked about. Yeah. Yes, it's evading the part that we talked about in the body problem conversation.
Yes.
Quite
And this is why I have been so transfixed by it.
Which is why it dedicates itself to the avoidance of suffering.
Yes. And death.
And like to the delusion that humanity alone can ascend.
Ascend. Yeah, exactly. No, it's the missing piece, right? Like it's the and the weird thing is for me personally, like I've been on, I mean, you've known me now for a couple of years, and it's been me just talking about death.
Yes.
Suffering. but I feel like I'm doing it in a party mode. I'm like, yay!
You remember how I like basically bailed on finishing the last bit of our conversation
I still want to get back to that actually
on Douglas Harding's book, The Hierarchy of Heaven and Earth, because I was really struggling with what he was saying about death. And I think now I'm at the point where, thanks to Sherry and Jess probably, that I get it.
Yeah.
So
yeah, we need to do that. We need to dive back into that.
But I would say that, and he was right in that. What freaked me out is like no matter what I say after this, there's no evading this. And then he did say some more hopeful things after that. But it's like I just kept going back to that sentence, and it's like, well, why? And the hopeful bit that came after it is also right, but there's still no avoidance of that hard bit. which that we talked about. But I
Right,
think
and
it is important. It is important to focus on the other half. So I do think at some point, like I hinted at toward the end of that conversation, like we do need to get to the other side of that. And this is actually the reason I'm saying this now. This is not a random sidetrack, actually,
Yeah.
because Tomberg talks about this difference between the closed circle
mhm.
and the open circle. And so I think this is a good time. Sherry, do you want to read
Yeah.
the parable that he gives talking about that?
Yes, yes, yes. Okay. I'm going to just read his introduction to it.
Yeah, go for it.
Do not be shocked, dear unknown friend, and do forgive me, for I am going to relate a myth, a cosmic myth from the Gnosis, not ancient or modern, but from the eternal Gnosis, because the cosmic drama is in reality a myth made flesh, and it must first be seen as such before one draws principal intellectual lessons from it. Therefore, I am going to relate the myth in order to draw from it some ideas which are related to the arcanum of the tarot with which we are occupied. And I would just like to make a little side comment
Go for it.
that George MacDonald says, when God wants a drama, he creates a Shakespeare.
Mhm.
That is the incarnation of the word, okay, in poetic terms. That is what Tomberg says here when he says a cosmic drama is a myth made flesh. That's exactly what George MacDonald said when he said, when God wants a drama, he makes a Shakespeare.
Right.
Okay.
Well, that's important because what McDonald's thinking about here, and then Tomberg pointing toward the necessity of incarnation of embodiments, right?
Yeah.
Which was a big theme in the recent body problem conversation we just had. It is showing that like God's activity in the world is through human beings.
Yeah.
That's why he became flesh in the person of Jesus Christ. Like it is through human beings that God chooses to act in the world.
You know, I just had this little thought about why the monkey's not happy. Because he doesn't want to go down.
No, he doesn't. He doesn't
Right.
want to go
And
down.
this is the whole thing of evasion, right? Of
Right.
evading death and evading.
Yes, the monkey is actually, yes, the monkey is like, he's afraid of the fall, of the descent, and he doesn't want to go, he doesn't want to go down into death because he knows that's where the descent ultimately leads.
Yeah.
And he doesn't trust that he will ascend on the other side.
Yeah.
Which is why he has fear.
Yeah. Okay, here we go with the myth. This is a fantastic myth. Do you know, like, did he write this? This is his.
Yeah, this is him. He's just like, I mean, he's absolutely drawing from scripture and tradition.
Of course. Yeah.
And doing it, but he's tying it together and synthesizing it.
Beautiful. Okay, when the Father had accomplished his work on the seventh day of creation that he had made through his word, he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had made. And the Father blessed the seventh day, and he sanctified it, because on this day he rested from all his work that he had created. Thus, the seventh day is blessed and sanctified, because it is the day not of the world and the movement of the world, but rather of the Father himself alone. It is the seventh part of the circle of movement of the world, when he withdraws and becomes immobile and silent. Thus it was that the circle of movement of the world was not closed, but remained open. And the seventh day was sanctified and blessed as the open part of the circle of movement of the world, in such a way that the beings of the world had access to the Father, and the Father had access to them. But the serpent said, there is no freedom for the world, insofar as the circle of the world is not closed, because freedom is to be in oneself, without interference from outside, especially from above, on the part of the Father. The world will always follow the will of the Father and not its own, insofar as there is an opening in the circle of the world, insofar as the Sabbath exists. And the serpent took his tail in his mouth, and thus formed a closed circle. He turned himself with great force, and thus created in the world a great swirl which caught hold of Adam and Eve. And the other beings upon whom Adam had impressed the names that he gave them followed them. And the serpent said to the beings of the world, moving on this side of the closed circle, that he had formed by taking his tail in his mouth and setting himself in rotation, "Here is your way. You will commence by my tail, and you will arrive at my head. Then you will have traversed the length of the circle of my being, and you will have within you the entire closed circle, and thus you will be free as I am free." But the woman guarded the memory of the world opened towards the Father and the Holy Sabbath. And she offered herself for the rending of the closed circle in herself in order to give birth to children issuing from the world beyond it, from the world where there is the Sabbath. Thus originated the suffering of her pregnancy, and thus originated sorrow on this side of the world of the serpent. And hostility came between woman and the serpent, between the generations of woman, giving birth with pain, and the generations of the serpent, giving birth with pleasure. The former will crush the head of the serpent, and the serpent will wound the heel of the woman. For woman moves in a contrary sense to the movement of the serpent, and her head reaches to the tail of the serpent, and her heels touch the head of the serpent. This is because in the world, which is the current of the serpent, suffering is its counter movement. It was through the counter movement of suffering that there originated the counter current of the sons of woman, which is the thought born from suffering and from memory of the world of the Sabbath. Thus the sons of woman set up altars to the Father, this side of the world of the serpent. And Enosh, son of Seth, not only worshipped the Father, but even came to know his name. He began to invoke the name of the Father. But Enoch, a descendant of Seth, went still further. He, quote, walked with God, unquote, Genesis verse 22. Or no, Genesis 5:22, sorry. He did not pass through the bitterness of death, which for living beings on this side of the circle of the serpent is the way out of the closed circle of the serpent. For he was, quote, taken up, unquote, by the Father, Genesis 5:24. For about that time, thought aspiring to the Father succeeded in piercing the circle of the serpent and in accomplishing an opening in the closed circle. Thus, initiation and prophecy could be established on this side of the world of the serpent. Initiation kept living the memory of the world of the Sabbath, and prophecy nourished the hope of deliverance from the circle of the serpent and the future reestablishment of the world of the Sabbath. Buddhas taught the way of going out from the world of the serpent and of arriving at the repose of the Sabbath. But the prophets proclaimed the transformation of the world of the serpent from within it by the coming of the Word, which will live in the world of the serpent and will reestablish within the world of the serpent not only the Sabbath, but also the other 6 days of creation, such as they were before a third of the beings from each of them were uprooted and swept down by the closed whirlwind of the serpent. Revelation 12:4. This came to be the woman virgin, who is the soul of the counter movement to the serpent and of suffering since the beginning of the world of the serpent, received, conceived, and gave birth to the Word of the Father. And the Word became flesh and dwelt amongst men in the world of the serpent, full of grace and truth. John 1:14.
Hey, Michael just dropped in.
Am I late?
That's okay. Don't worry about it. That's
I
good.
thought we were
So
at noon.
Sherry just read the long parable that Tomberg gives about the world of the serpents.
The myth.
You want to give him the page number because my PDF is like
Yeah,
that
it's,
weird page numbering.
Page 239.
Yeah, I got it. Mhm.
Yeah, I think it's like 252 in my PDF copy. I have a hard copy too, but I make my notes in the PDF so I don't have to mess up my book.
Michael, I always say better late than never. Okay.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So the
Come
first
on
thing,
here.
one thing I wanted to share there that was occurring to me is that I want to talk about the word and the woman there for a moment, because I've been reading Stephen Webb's The Divine Voice, and it occurs to me, and Tomberg is very clear on this back in letter 6, where it's like hearing the voice of the serpent initiates the fall, right?
Mhm.
So it is actually hearing that comes prior to seeing in the process of redemption too. So before you have eyes to see the kingdom, you have to have ears to receive the word.
Which is again an image of an infant.
Yeah, right, exactly, which we talked about in the body problem conversation, because yeah, in the womb the infant is able to hear the world before it's able to experience the world
Mhm.
visually.
And I talked to you the other day about watching my puppies with their eyes closed. And I kept thinking, well, why can't they just have their eyes open? They can find their mother, because they're like, grunting around trying to find a teat. But then I realized, no, they're sharpening their nose and their ears. Like they got 10 days of intense, where's my mother? Where's the food? Right?
Yeah, I
And
think this is kind of like, this is the Hebrew like counterbalance to the Greek tendency to hyper focus on the visual.
yeah,
So
yeah. But I wrote a little note here on page 239 when he
Mhm.
says, but the serpent said there is no freedom for the world insofar as the circle of the world is not closed, because freedom is to be in oneself without interference from outside, especially from above, on the part of the Father. The world will always follow the will of the Father and not its own, insofar as there is an opening in the circle of the world.
right, so
Which-
it's the very first false worldview. Like if you look at the Jordan Daniel Wood clip that I shared yesterday in
Right.
the conversation I had with Michael, that's the very first. It's the origination of the first false worldview, and it's a false view of freedom.
It's also really parallel to what Satan says to God in the
Mm.
book of Job. He
Right,
says, you've hedged him in, right?
right.
And he has everything he needs. Let me take that away. Right. So in a sense, Satan's describing this open world, right, where God is gifting Job.
Yep.
And Satan wants to close it off.
Yeah.
Right. And then he says, let's see what happens when we do that. Right. To Job.
And what is Job's reaction when he starts experiencing the closed world of the serpent? He wants to escape it, to die.
Well, he wants to never be born, which I think is different,
Right.
but that's another conversation.
Okay. No, what? That's what is the difference between never wanting to be born and wanting to die?
Well, I think there's a realization there. I think there's a running in the background in Job's mind
Mhm.
is he doesn't run towards the edge of a cliff. Like he doesn't try to commit suicide. He doesn't talk about suicide.
Right.
He goes back to the past, actually. So he doesn't move towards the future, right? He's not a forward movement towards suicide. He reaches back to the past and realizes that to exist, this is my theory, okay? To exist is to suffer. So
Gotcha.
this
So
is something that Job,
it echoes to tie it back to Tomberg's text. It echoes what Tomberg observes about Solomon's observation in Ecclesiastes, where he points like the reason this is in the Holy Scriptures is because Solomon is having a perfect realization of how totally futile the closed world of the serpent is. That's why it's Holy Scripture.
yes.
And so Job doesn't yet see the possibility of resurrection, essentially.
But he does throughout the book.
Right, exactly. But at that point, he doesn't.
Yeah.
Right.
No, at that
okay,
point-
now I do. Yeah, no, that's an important difference, and you're right. Yeah.
Yeah. And then I thought of Tomberg's previous statement where he said spiritual freedom is existence. And I wondered maybe if you guys could elaborate on, because Satan is saying there is no freedom for the world, right? But he says freedom.
Well, because because it's for Satan, like freedom is entirely a negative freedom, right? Freedom of interference from above, to exist on your own terms.
Right, right.
But
So what is,
what's
okay,
the
go ahead.
anti-Satan here, though, in this passage?
In this passage?
It's the woman.
Sophia.
Oh,
Yeah,
Sophia.
Sophia,
Right.
yeah.
Yes, yes, yes.
I mean, that's what it is, right? I mean, that's
Right, it's Sophia.
this is how
It
Tomberg
really is Sophia.
he
yeah.
builds in his sophiology in subtle ways, and some places like this, and more obvious ways, like in the 19th letter, and the 11th letter. You know, so I mean, I think that's an incredible insight. I mean, I think it must have informed my consciousness way back in the day, and
Totally.
something that grew over time. But how, and of course, in a way, what Tomberg does here with Satan is science is implicit in that project, right? Right. I mean, just think of modern science as completely closed off from the supernatural, completely closed up, or grace, or whatever you want to call it, right? And which is, I'm sure that's the science, whatever it looks like in say 500 years, will not look like it looks now, because it won't be able to survive. And what's actually kind of cool is we've been watching the authority of at least the monetary aspect of science being destroyed over the last few years, so to the point where they have no credibility anymore.
Yeah.
Which I think, could open up to a new understanding of science, but it's going to take a while because people are still, the propaganda is still pretty strong.
Yeah. Yeah.
But this is the sophiological insight, and this is why when I wrote Transfiguration, the one chapter is Sophia and Ahriman, because that's the antidote to the toxicity of modernity. I mean, even later in where he's talking about bestiality. I don't know if you guys caught this video this week that was circling on Twitter, maybe in other places, social media, of the zoophilia pride parade in Germany.
No.
And people talking about how much they love having sex with their animals in public, on the street, like it's a parade, like we're celebrating this. And it's like, well,
you mean the slope was in fact slippery?
That's right. That's right.
Exactly as slippery as it was suggested to be.
But that's what
that makes
Tomberg's going. That's where Tomberg anticipates that in this chapter.
Yeah.
When he talks about, I mean, think about this. And I know, Sherry, I've been thinking about you all week because my one lamb, because we didn't dock their tails because they're going to go to the butcher pretty soon. He got an infected tail. And I've been treating it. Actually, it's looking pretty good now. But I think about, I keep telling my wife, I love these lambs so much. They're the greatest. I love these animals.
Yeah.
And, and I mean, think about this. I really love my animals.
Yeah, me too.
Those cows and the sheep. I just, I want to take care of them,
Yeah.
And you think about that kind of love, and how can then these people expressing eros towards animals,
Yeah.
which is, and it's disgusting, absolutely disgusting what they're I mean, you can call it animal trafficking, right? Because people do the same thing to children and women. They traffic them for their own pleasure.
Yeah.
And I couldn't, I was just thinking, what a horrible, horrible world. And all the
there's no way
all the demons are in the open.
There's no way that's not exploitative. Like,
No.
It's like you want to talk about a power imbalance. In
I
a
don't even like
relationship.
thinking about it. It's gross. Just terrible. Just awful.
Well, which is such a counter, an anti-view from the idea that he raises here of the holy living creatures, right?
Right.
And
Goodness.
you have to think that,
But that's what the closed circle does, doesn't it? Like there is no above. There's no sacred. Right.
It's no sacred. And that's the thing is, even so, you know that you have the experience, Sherry, is that even though I'm going to eat those lambs, there's a holy living creature before me, right? It's it's attached to that,
Yes.
it's because, and it's attached to that. I mean, organically, you could say, naturally,
Mhm.
but it's also attached to that because of my attention and my intentionality toward those animals,
Yes.
right? Where you treat them with respect and you treat them well and you want to take care of them, right?
Mhm.
And not just because because later I can have a lamb chop. That's not why you take care of them. You want to take care of them because you want them to be well.
Well,
Yes.
Michael, in our conversation that we had a little last week on Sherry's body problem, I shared this Alaskan Native myth that an Orthodox priest who was giving a talk about how the Orthodox missionaries interacted with the Alaskan natives in Alaska. He related this myth where Raven like gathers the animals together and it's like, what are we going to do about this weird new pink creature that's like totally weak and incompetent and
Washed up on
can't
the
seem to
shore.
fend for, washed up on the shore, it can't seem to fend for itself. And the animals decided that they would help the human being out by giving up themselves. So there's this like Eucharistic sort of view of the way that animals give up their life for the sustenance of the human being.
Right.
Yes.
No, so in regards to that, no, in Sophia in Exile, I quote from what I think is a great little, I don't know if it's a prose poem or a short essay by Gary Snyder about the takeover from inside. He talks it's about deer hunting and how the deer hunting is not about the men going to capture the deer. It's about the deer capturing the men.
Mhm.
Because when the men, shoot a deer and they eat the flesh of the deer, it goes inside of them and that wildness becomes part of them. And then he
Right.
says, this is what we call the takeover from inside.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And there was do you remember, you're probably not old enough. There was a magazine probably back in the 80s, maybe to the early 90s, called Gnosis.
Mhm.
You remember this? There was a great article, which at the time I was a vegetarian, but I read this article written by this neo-pagan guy called, and I think it was a neo-pagan Freemason. And the article was called The Hunter's Eucharist.
Yeah.
Which I just love that idea, right? And actually, I think that was at the point where I said, maybe I'm not going to be a vegetarian too much longer.
Yeah, I have a poem that's called Reflections in the Meat Department. That's basically, it's like kind of like just reflection on how pathetic the entire situation of like buying meat in the supermarket is.
Yeah.
Right. And kind of reflects on like how my ancestors would have hunted, and then talks about how like my way of honoring the animal is the fact that I take my cooking seriously.
Mm-hmm.
So there's all this sort of like culinary imagery in the poem about like how I will prepare this pork shoulder that I have bought cryovac in the supermarket to at least honor the animal in the only way that's accessible to me, although hopefully in another life I will be able to meet him more honorably again.
Yeah.
So
I wrote a poem the other day. It's about flowers, but it's the same idea of this. I don't know how to describe it. I often just call it simultaneous reciprocity, right? That we experience. But this is what Sophia offers us. Sophia offers us the inroad to this kind of Eucharistic. How did you put that, Michael? The hunting thing, the Eucharistic.
The Hunter's Eucharist.
The Hunter's Eucharist, right? To that reciprocity that we have with the natural world, right? So I wrote this little thing the other day. It's just called Yellow Flowers. They block my path on the way to the outhouse. Each head bobs precariously on bowed backs, smiling, bright, and eternally optimistic. I don't know their names, but they are everywhere. These stretch ever more tenuously across my path, asking to be seen. But what is my eye to them? Must it fall like the sun across their faces? a less glorious but still glowing orb? It seems to be so. So, you know, like the flower, to me, like the purpose of the flower is to be seen, right?
Mhm.
And
I think that's a good place to segue into all of the stuff that Tomberg says in this chapter about plants.
yeah, and the purpose of the animal is to be eaten in our world. And
Right.
sorry about that for all the vegans and vegetarians out there, but
That's right. Yeah. But they all saw The Lion King and they know about the circle of life. Well, it's true, right? I mean, boy, and I think,
But I mean, there are some biblical texts that I would point toward that itself is also being a result of the closed circle, though, right? And that the open circle, that the spiral offers another way. That's why you have verses about like the lion sitting down with the lamb.
well, the open circle, I just want to mull this over to get it right in my own head. The open circle, or this closed circle is opened through conception, sorrow in conception and birth. Is that
That's what he says in that parable.
yes?
Yeah.
Okay, that's what I just want to be sure that I have that understood that properly, because I don't want to understand it the way I want to understand it. I want to understand
Yeah,
it
let
the
me
way-
just read what he says here, like right after what you just read. He says, the open circle or the spiral is the world before the fall of the 6 days of creation, crowned by the seventh day, the cosmic Sabbath, which corresponds to what one designates in mathematics as the step of the spiral. It suggests the idea of unlimited growth and advancement, being through its form only the introduction or antechamber to eternity. It promises unlimited progress. That would be like further, like epistasis, really, is what he's talking about there. The closed circle, in contrast, is in principle only a prison, whatever its extent may be. It is a wheel which turns on itself and therefore suggests no advancement beyond its circle. The idea that the closed circle or wheel suggests is that of eternal repetition. That's why there's no escape. That's why even death is not really an escape, which is why Job wishes to never have been born.
Yes, that's
Because
really
if
important.
it's eternal repetition, he can endlessly, which is why Tomberg talks about the Buddha, right? Escaping the wheel of reincarnation,
Yeah.
right? Because death isn't actually, if you're still within the framework of
No,
the
you're
closed
stuck.
circle, death is not an escape.
No, it's not. It isn't. You can't be born. You can never have existed. That's Job's conclusion,
Yeah.
which to me gives me a really, like, the insight that brings me is why God says to Satan, go ahead and trust the process, because he knows Job.
Right.
He knows Job already knows that.
Right.
And it's super important to know that.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, I have a question. This is going backwards from the myth, but I just want to ask it
Okay,
before we
that's
pass right
fine.
over it. Page 237 at the very bottom, I'll just start with the first sentence. It is similar for the whole of evolution, for there is natural selection and there is spiritual selection or election. The inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah had sinned against nature and had been rejected by natural selection, but they would have been able to survive if 10 righteous men had been found amongst them. Then spiritual selection would have spared them, owing to the 10 righteous men. The fact of having evolved and of having given shelter to 10 righteous men among them would have been sufficient to justify the continuance of their existence, although their customs were contrary to nature. So,
Yep, that's our world, man.
yeah,
Their
yeah,
customs were contrary to nature. I mean, my gosh.
yeah, right. So he says, I should have read this first. Exotericism lives in processes, esotericism in tragedies and dramas. The ancient mysteries were tragedies and dramas. It is here where their esoteric character lies. Exotericism corresponds to the mentality and psychology of a passenger. Esotericism to that of a member of the crew. Exotericism is not purely and simply an illusion, though. For if 10 righteous men had been found, God would have spared these cities, right? So he makes this analogy, the passenger and crew analogy.
Yeah.
And I think that's really interesting because to me
That's the battle Job's fighting against his friends.
exactly. They're passengers and he's the crew.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's coming into, he's not a crew yet. He's in the process of being transformed. And so he's moving from being a passenger into becoming crew.
Well, I would
But
say
they're
he
still
is.
fully in passenger mode.
Yeah, but I would actually say he is, because to me, the passenger is not participating and the crew is it's participatory.
Yes, correct. Participation is the
So,
difference.
Right. And so Job, the story opens with Job consecrating his children in
Okay.
case.
So you're
right?
saying he's already a crew
He's,
from the
he's
beginning.
already a crew. He's not like, he probably couldn't run the whole ship.
Right.
But he, he's participating.
He's Christ-like, but he's not Christ. He can't run the
Right.
whole ship. Gotcha.
Not yet, not till the end of the book. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So my question was like, what does righteous mean in this context? Does anybody have any ideas? Because I'm really
Oh.
this is my new question.
What is righteous? He doesn't, but I mean,
To be allied with the good. That's what
Yeah.
it is.
yeah.
And that's what I couldn't
Thank you.
help. I can't help but
Writing
thinking
that
about
down.
Or to be alive with the counter principle, Michael. It's to be to live to live in accordance with perceiving the Sophia and not the serpent.
Well, yeah, and that's the thing, and what this passage is making me think of is, the state of Western civilization right now
Ugh.
is, I mean, it's Sodom and Gomorrah on steroids.
Yeah.
I just mentioned that crazy pride parade in Germany the other day, but it's all over the place, and I think this is what happens with a civilization that does not, as a civilization, participate in the transcendent or in immanence, because then the closed circle is all you have left, right? So it just degenerates. It's not evolution, it's devolution is what we're seeing.
Well,
And its
I like to
principle
think-
is pleasure. And its principle is pleasure,
I like
as
to think of it
opposed
as-
to the suffering of the woman,
yes,
which is why
exactly.
people find it appealing.
said that.
Concupiscence, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I like to think about it as reciprocal narrowing, right? Like
And it's not open.
Mm-mm.
It's not
Right.
it's not a spiral. It's degenerative.
Yeah.
And you could say if you looked at the trajectory of Western civilization, there was a part where it was on the ascendance, right?
Mhm.
And you could even say, after the Enlightenment, in one way that was about as good as it was going to get without God, and then where does it go from there? It has no place to go but down.
Right.
Well, he makes a point somewhere in here. I can't remember where it is. That about Plato. Maybe
Well,
it's
because the Enlightenment had the hubris of thinking that it could avoid the fall.
But the Enlightenment was still standing on the foundation of Christendom,
Yes.
right? So it took all the assumptions of Christendom about rights and things like this, right? And for a while it worked with that kind of deist and then theist and then agnostic and then atheist approach to things. It could survive for a while because it was kind of it already had a decent headwind.
You can actually
But
see it as
now
a
it
process
doesn't.
of involution too.
Well,
Coming as it just basically from the peak of medieval European thought, it's just it's a process of involution, at least in terms of openness to spirit.
Mhm. And then, yeah, I mean, it's I mean, and almost in every case, what we see now, it ends up being a war on creation. And I don't want
Yeah.
to say nature. I'm saying on creation.
On creation.
no. I
Yeah.
mean, just if you could see the space junk out there, in the world, like in outer space, the garbage. I saw a diagram one time. It's terrifying. You know, like
Yeah, I think that's why the aliens haven't visited our planet, because we have
I think it's
this big
No-
garbage dump.
no
Makes it very,
signs
very
of-
dangerous to try to land a ship.
No signs that they're civilized people. Keep moving.
yeah. Oh, that's a dump. Let's just keep
Yeah.
going. Yeah.
mean-
I wrote a little notes, reciprocal narrowing here. Let me just read this to see if it follows suit with what you're talking about. Now this is page 251, Michael, second paragraph. Now, with respect to ourselves, we are able in the first place to see in the serpent only the principle of cerebration, cerebral intellectuality, and the principle of enfoldment, the tendency to form closed circles, or in other words, the principle of the fall. I say in the first place, because thanks to the work of salvation, which has a millennial old history, a gradual spiritualization of the work of the serpent, including cerebral intellectuality, has taken place. And because intervention from above not only frustrates the formation of completely closed circles, but also gives to the tendency of enfoldment a direction towards solidarity through stages such as the family, the nation, and the community of civilization. In other words, Providence sees to it that the circles formed by the serpent are not entirely closed, and that the series of its circles is changed into a series of many spirals.
Well, reminds me of one of the warnings of Fatima was that the last battle between Satan and Christ would be fought on but the family.
Interesting. Yeah, because that opens a circle.
Yeah, and all those things that he just mentioned there, the family, the nation, the community of civilization, those have been or are in the process of being destroyed or atomized.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And this is what Steiner calls their social and anti-social forces.
And to be replaced by a closed circle system.
Right. Where we own nothing and we're happy.
True.
Yeah. I mean, that's the epitome of a closed system.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
So
I'm depressed now.
you talked about enfoldment,
Yeah,
right?
we
But then he talks about enfoldment, but he, like, to go back to what you're talking about with your flower poem there, he gives like
You're a little blurry.
that kind of
Little
like
blurry,
blossoming. Oh, sorry.
You're
He
a
gives
little-
that like that blossoming of the plant kingdom as like the contrary to that movement.
Mhm.
Your camera's a bit blurry, Nate, for some reason.
I don't know what to do about it. Try.
Okay. Maybe tap. There you go. Tap it. Sometimes it just has to.
I don't know.
Oh well.
It didn't like that I moved. So now it's kind of out of focus.
Yeah.
Let me try turning it off and on. I'll be a disembodied voice for a second.
The Holy Grail. There we go.
Hey, there we go. That's what did it.
Mhm.
It doesn't like it when I don't have that nice a camera, so it doesn't deal well when I move. So
Sorry for interrupting. You were
I
saying.
just wanted to talk about, he talks about the contrary of that enfoldment, and he talks about and it is in
Unfoldment.
in terms of the opening, the blossoming, and he uses the plant kingdom as an analogy for talking about that.
Yep. This is for us, Sherry, this is page 258.
Okay.
When he talks about the way of metamorphosis, is that what you're talking about, Nate?
That's one of the sections. There's
Okay.
actually a few, but yeah, go for that one, because that's the one where he mentions Goethe, I think, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yes, he does.
Oh, actually, before you get, let me read this really shorter piece really quick before you do that. But let us return to the world of the serpent. The most general characteristic and feature of this world is enfoldment, which Sherry just read. Whilst the most general characteristic feature of the created world is unfoldment, blossoming, and radiation. Thus, the brain and intestines in the animal kingdom are due to enfoldment. Foliage, branches, and flowers are expressions of the contrary tendency in the plant kingdom. Thus, for example, foliage is the lung of the plant, unfolded and open to the air, whilst the animal or human lung is enfolded foliage. Another example, the sun is in a state of radiation whilst the planets are in state of condensation, i.e. enfoldment. And then he says that these are the principles of light and darkness.
Yep, pure Goethe right there.
And how do plants feed? Through the
Mhm.
light directly.
Yep. Levity versus gravity.
That's what they teach. That to me, that's the greatest lesson that you can get from a plant.
Right, which is the section that Michael is getting ready to read on metamorphosis,
let's
goes
do
into
it.
He says, how is this to be done? By way of metamorphosis, that is, by alternating contraction and expansion. Just as the growth of a plant is the manifestation of two tendencies, a vertical tendency and a horizontal tendency, operating alternately, so that the former pushes upwards and the latter affects its blossoming out, so does psychic metamorphosis operate by restriction of the expansive tendency, which results in elevation, followed by expansion on the new plane attained by elevation, which in turn will be followed by restriction, resulting in a new elevation, and so on. This is the law of metamorphosis, which Goethe ascertained and studied in the plant realm, and is also the law of transmutation of psychic forces, the narrow way or the way of the cross in the human kingdom. Right? For human beings and plants live under the law of the cross,
Mhm.
the latter organically, the former spiritually. For this reason, the plant is a manual of practical hermeticism,
Mhm.
where one can read the immutable laws of spiritual discipline. Schiller, the brother of Goethe, understood this, which is why he said, "Dost thou seek the highest, the greatest? The plant can show it thee. What the plant is unconsciously, be thou intentionally." That's it.
Yeah, it's totally true.
Mhm.
You know, I was telling Jess in our last show conversation, I was walking through the woods and I was in thick woods. It was fairly dark in there. And in the distance, I could see this yellow flower and it was like 5 feet off the ground. And I didn't have my glasses on, so it was a little blurry. I was like, what is that?
Just-
I've never seen
just- Go ahead. I'm sorry. I didn't mean.
I've never seen a 5-foot flower in the forest before. So I thought, what is that? So I went and looked, and it was one of these yellow flowers that I wrote the poem about. They're in the
Oh,
fields.
wow.
everywhere. But it was in a dark forest. Okay. So it grew this long, spindly stem, and it leaned itself against a tree for support because it was so fragile. And it grew up, and then it turned and wrapped itself around the trunk of the tree. And then the stem went up, and at the top was the head of the flower, like the flower head. And right where that one flower head was, 5 feet off the ground, the sun was shining on it. There was a beam of sunlight that came through this dark forest right on that plant, right there. And I got to see it. And I was just like, that's like, this is the manual that he says here, you know. The plant can show it you. What the plant is unconsciously, be thou intentionally.
Right.
Seek the light, right? Like that's what that
And
said to me when I saw it.
Two thoughts. He also says in another section, he says that all gardens are a representation of the garden in some way.
He says it right after this. It's the next couple sentences.
Right. And then if you want to go ahead, if you wanted to read it, since you're right there, Michael.
I don't mind if I do. This is because the plant kingdom is the most virginal realm of nature following the fall, because man is on his way, on the way to reintegration. Every garden, therefore, preserves something of the Garden of Eden and can serve as a living library for someone aspiring to salvation.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and I was thinking in our body problem conversation, I don't know if I brought it up in there, but you know, I've talked about a few times. I've talked about like how when Christ talks about faith like a mustard seed, it's people tend to focus on the size of the mustard seed.
Yes.
It's not, but it's actually more of an analogy of what the mustard seed does. How is a plant born? It's born from seed, which has to go into the ground and die, to crack open, to be broken before it can be born.
Right. Well, okay. I don't know if we're all jogging around here too much, but this came to my mind when you were just saying that. So on page 245 at the top, he talks about Leibniz and Schopenhauer.
Mhm.
And he says, Leibniz, the philosopher of optimism, said that the given world is the most perfect of possible worlds. Schopenhauer, the philosopher of pessimism, said that in the given world, the sum of suffering outweighs that of joy, and that the world of our experience is therefore not only imperfect, but also in the last analysis, evil. Okay. Both Leibniz and Schopenhauer looked at the totality of experience of the world as we are now seeking to, and what a difference in what they saw. So from the point of view of pure thought, which is that of Leibniz, the totality of the world shows up without any doubt, a perfect arrangement of equilibrium, a harmonious functioning of its essential parts, and despite what may take place in its more obscure nooks and crannies, the totality of the world taken in its great outlines, in its essential outlines, is harmony itself. From the point of pure will, which is that of Schopenhauer, the experience of each individual being in the world confirms the diagnosis of the world given by Gautama Buddha, which diagnosis is therefore to be accepted as true. The heart says to us, the cosmos, this marvel of wisdom, beauty, and goodness, suffers. It is ailing. This great organism, which cannot have been born out of sickness, whose birth must have been due to perfect health, i.e., to perfect wisdom, beauty, and goodness, the totality of which was its cradle, this great organism is ailing. The continents and the planets grow ever more hard, petrifying. This is the sclerosis of the cosmos, and on the surface of its land masses, in the process of petrification, and in the deeps of the seas and in the air, there reigns the struggle for existence. This is the fever of inflammation in the world. But sick as it is, the world still retains everywhere and always characteristics of its primordial health, and shows the working of forces of its new health, its convalescence, because alongside the struggle for existence, there is cooperation in order to live. And alongside the mineral petrification, there is the succulent and breathing cover of the plant kingdom. The world can therefore be lauded and wept for at the same time. This is the origin of the problem of the fall, that the world is worthy of being sung for and wept for at the same time. I just love that.
Yeah. And I think you saw yesterday, Mike and I interviewed Ronald Hutton, the scholar.
Yeah, I have yet to
on
watch that.
folklore and paganism, Christianity. And one of the things we talked about was the migration away from the land over the 19th century into the 20th, which kind of emptied out the festival life of people, right?
Mhm.
Because people were no longer connected to nature as they were when most societies were primarily agrarian, right? And I mean, and I know this from experience, having grown up in the city, and now I'm a farmer, that when we, I mean, because people, I think when they hear about what I do, and I think they come away with the mistaken assumption that everything, it's like a romantic poet, you know, that it's all idealism and it's not killing and making, you know. I wrote a poem recently
yourself.
about where I'm, you know, the same person, the same farmer is both the midwife and the butcher.
Yeah.
You know, so it was about when we were raising goats at the time, and this one goat was having problem kidding. She delivered one and she still had two more in there, and I had to reach in and pull it out. And then 2 years later, I was butchering that same goat, right? So it's a participation in, I mean, I don't want to keep quoting Walt Disney, but in the circle of life, it's really, I mean, that's, and there's a sacredness to that.
Yeah.
Most people, you know, outsource their killing, whether they're killing plants or they're killing animals, right?
Well, they try
And-
to keep those things
Well,
distinct.
that's what I was processing. That the guilt of outsourcing my killing is what I was processing in that poem,
Yeah.
Reflections in the Meat Department. And that's like, and my way of coping with that is like, okay, I'm outsourcing my killing, but at least I can still honor this animal by cooking
Right.
it really damn well.
Right. And that's, and I think, and that's the kind of, I wouldn't only call it a sacred approach to thing, but or I would call it ethical as well.
Yeah.
And ethical doesn't quite make it. Sacred is really
It's
this
the
is
only way to
why
do
you pray before you eat,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
But it's so hard for us to remind ourselves that we are actually part of nature.
Well,
Right.
like you use the description midwife and butcher, and we see those things as opposing each other. But, Tomberg says, just below what I read, he says, it is this contradiction which the term the fall alludes to. In the first place, it designates a state of affairs in the world which gives the impression that the world is composed of two independent, if not opposed worlds.
Right.
Yeah,
that's-
right. And then he talks about the errors of dualism not too long after
Right.
that.
And when you occupy the space that Michael's talking about, where you play the midwife and the butcher, then you realize that it's actually not opposed. And
that's
it's only, I think, like it only becomes one movement when it's sacred.
and what gets bizarre though is when you have someone living in that closed circle of evolution, in our society, right? They're closed off from the realm of the spirit, and they try to middle manage farmers by
Yeah.
telling them you need to use less animal. We have to get rid of 80% of animals on farms.
I
And
read
it's-
something not too long ago that I don't remember the source, so I'm not gonna be able to validate it or put it in the notes. But it actually takes less acreage of land to feed a person if you're raising animals as well as plants than it does.
That's the
It's
point.
like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's like 0.44 acres per person if you're raising animals too, which means, by the way, that if everyone were engaged in farming and we were farming and we turned every available acre of land into farmland, we could support a population of 38 billion.
Yes,
Yes.
it's true.
Overpopulation is bullshit.
It is. It
It's
is.
total bullshit.
And this is, I mean, when they say this and people believe it,
Right.
that's
Yeah,
the
they
thing.
do.
They believe that if you get rid of the animals, everything's going to be better. Let me tell you right now, ever since we started raising cows, we upped our
Production.
our vegetation game.
Yes.
Moved up big time.
Right. Right.
I was
And
just
only
gonna
have
say that.
we have one cow and a steer, and right there, I mean, and we live on 10 acres, but 6 of it is woods. So we have about an acre of garden, not even, and the rest is pasture and and just around the stuff around the house. And it's amazing how much food comes from just that.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
I mean, we have 30 people in our CSA. It's a relatively small CSA, but it's 30 people who get a big box of vegetables every week
Right.
for 20 weeks, right? I mean,
Well,
it's
I that's
stunning.
part of the reason I grew my flock to 18, because my vegetation was suffering.
Yeah.
My pastures.
Yeah,
And I've like one of the best things I ever bought was a manure spreader. I bought myself this manure, so I'm so excited about it.
Just by the way, Michael, just running your numbers that you just gave kind of validates that statistic, because you're actually, I mean, you're not feeding these people 100%. You're only feeding them partially, but you're contributing a good chunk to their diet. That's 30
That's
people
only on
off of
3 acres
4
or
work
1 acre.
acres of land.
Mhm.
That's like 7.5 people per acre
And
being at least
Mhm.
partially fed. So so a number of 0.44 people fully fed per acre of land that has worked with both animals and plant sounds like a pretty realistic figure.
it is, and that's the other thing. We have all grown up under the myth of scarcity,
Yep,
when the real truth about nature is it's super abundant.
Yes.
that's right.
It's super abundant. There's so many. I mean,
Which is
nature
the open,
produces much
that's the
more than it
open
needs.
circle, though. You can't see the abundance without seeing the world of the spiral of the open circle. That's
Right.
what allows you to see the principle of abundance. As long as you're trapped within the closed circle, scarcity is in fact the rule. And it's the rule because it's survival of the fittest. That's what makes it the rule. And the cooperation for existence is not taking precedence as it would in the open circle.
Right. Yeah. That Darwin bullshit. Yeah. Well, because I mean, it's a validation of the British monarchy, right?
Mm.
Yeah.
That's all. That's what survival of the fittest means.
Yeah, yeah.
It's an analogy when you
Yeah.
apply it to animals.
Yeah, and
Um,
I recently, I don't know, I read it somewhere how, oh no, it was in that conversation that Jordan Peterson had with that DeWall. He's if anybody wants to watch an interesting conversation, Franz DeWall and Jordan Peterson. And he pointed out, Franz DeWall pointed out that at the time, the maternal aspect or the role of the female in evolution was completely disregarded because they had this Victorian notion that it was all about power and
Right.
strength and anyway.
I think that maybe that's why Sarah Coakley has done such good work in on the principle of cooperation and evolution.
Yeah.
Maybe it takes a woman to see it.
And well, Tomberg talks about it, right?
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's interesting now one of the things this is, let me totally take this into a different direction
Yeah, let's do it.
Go
just for a
it,
second.
Michael.
But Sherry was talking about a manure spreader.
Yay.
Now, in biodynamic farming, there's kind of a maxim that you start farming biodynamically, 7 years, you're going to see big difference in your farm and stuff, which is true. This is our 7th year at this place. Can't compare to any. It's really been a great year for production. For the plants are looking really healthy. But for manure spreaders, and this hasn't happened. We used to have to go out into the pastures and pick up the cow patties, right? Now we have crows.
Mm.
Some people will put their chickens out there, but I can't put my chickens out there because there are too many things out there that'll eat them. So, but crows have moved in, and so they're spreading the manure
They
around.
pick it, yeah.
And that's what one of the principles in biodynamic farming is, that what you're doing is creating a self-enclosed system, and that it's not just about the farmer and the plants and the animals that he grows or raises, but it's also about the cooperation with the other kingdoms of nature.
Yes, exactly.
So
And they
this
do that
year
on their own.
the insects are basically leaving our plants alone.
Yeah.
Even the cabbage family, which is bizarre because they never
Wow.
leave that alone.
No, they never do.
But we seem to have achieved some kind of
Balance.
stability and balance. And we did have some rabbits coming in, but they kind of went away. I mean, they're still around, but they're not bothering the garden too much.
Mhm.
And of course you have owls and whatever else is around. So and that kind of holistic approach to things is tremendously healing, not only for the land, but for societies. And when people talk about regenerative or sustainable agriculture, this is not what they mean.
No, it
Right.
isn't.
Right.
This is not what. So that's false advertising,
Yeah,
as far
it
as
is.
I'm concerned.
Yeah.
So, and that's what gosh, I've been pushing this sociological perspective on these things for such a long time. But that's the whole point, is that if you live as if you're part of nature, and then you are a part of nature.
I would say the way you described what you're setting up there, it actually does have the features of an open circle, because so much of what you're doing is allowing things to just be what they are.
Yeah, because you don't really, and once you get it going,
Well,
Right.
it's like
there's not as much work as there was at the beginning.
I've
Right.
had this like awesome privilege of the
Yeah.
whole watershed area here has changed because of logging, and old lakes and old creek beds and old riverbeds are filling up because they clear cut, right? So there's no trees like further away to suck up the water. Anyway, this lake that formed on our property, every year it's something amazingly new. Like now we have bulrushes and we have marsh marigolds and we have reed grass and canary grass and all kinds of stuff coming up everywhere, and then new animals. So I was hanging out by the lake in my hammock the other day, and this frog popped his head up, and I thought, oh, I've never seen a frog. He had these really fleshy lips and they were white. And so I got my binoculars, because I wanted to look at his markings so I could identify him. And he just hung out with me for like half an hour, So I got a really good look. And then I looked him up and he's an endangered species. He's on the red list. And I'm like, oh, that's awesome.
Well,
And then down below us, there's another lake forming. And my husband said to me yesterday, he said, it's covered in duckweed. Like every inch of it is covered. And I said, well, let's see what duckweed does. Duckweed extracts all the toxins out of the water, the nitrates, and then shades the top of the water to prohibit algae growth. And I'm like, oh, it's doing what it needs to do, right? Because it was an old forest, so it's full of trees, lots of dead organic matter, and the duckweed has a job to do, right? And it's just so amazing to watch this unfold like right before our eyes, right? That some people go, oh, we got to get rid of that duckweed.
Notice
right?
the word you used, unfold.
Yes.
Blossom.
Sorry,
Radiates.
we're talking about this regeneration and I'm just watching it happen all around me
Well,
right now.
Right.
and that's kind of blows my mind in the popular media, right? You hear about they act as if we're going to run out of water.
Yeah.
Like it never rains
Right.
or something. What? It's a closed system, right?
Yeah.
And if you notice, I've been paying attention to this for a few years. So say in this continent or maybe across the world, there might be a part of the continent or the world that's experiencing extreme heat, like this summer in Britain. They're having drought.
Yeah.
But what usually you see happen though in someplace else on the earth is having flooding
Mhm.
because it's a closed system.
Yeah.
Right. It's not, and we think we can control it, or and I think exploitation is the right word that you used earlier, Nate, is that people exploit or powers exploit what and present a perception of nature or creation that has nothing to do with nature or creation as much as it does with their as offering themselves tools for exploitation, whether it is of nature or of other human beings,
Mhm.
right? And that's why Guido Preparata, my man,
Mhm.
when he talks about economies, and economy should be, he says, like a biodynamic farm, a self-enclosed system with zero waste output, right?
Yeah.
So all the waste go into the farm, and which it's never going to be perfect or 100%, but that's the ideal,
Mhm.
right? Is zero, you don't bring anything outside of the farm that you can't create on the farm. No, nobody does that. Almost nobody, because you'd have to have a big farm to be able to do that. So for us, we're only on 10 acres. We don't have enough to grow hay, right? So I have to get some local hay and local feed because I don't have field space for growing corn or barley or anything. So you do what you can do, right? The perfect is the enemy of the good. But it's stunning. And I think this is all very pertinent to what Thomberg is talking about in this closed versus open circle.
Yeah.
Because our economies are closed circles. And how can we open that circle to life, right? This is even, I think, Nate, you read it, Bulgakov's book on economy.
Yeah.
I mean, he talks about, we need to have that our economies are based on death. And that we need to have an economy based on life, which is a Sophianic economy. And that's absolutely what we need.
Yeah.
It's absolutely what we need. And Thomberg, even though he's not talking about economics here, it's implied. And I think this principle that he's talking about with this model, the closed versus the open circle, that there's so much application of that into all these different domains, and I think even in families, right? So restriction versus openness, right? And how do you do that? And I think that's going to be an important task for humanity in the future, for sure. I don't know how. I wish more people get at it in the near future, but I think we'll be forced to it. Otherwise, I think we will find ourselves in a condition of a kind of slavery, right? A kind of what's that movie that I watched a couple weeks ago? Soylent Green. You ever see that movie?
Yeah.
I couldn't believe when I watched it that the beginning and credits, people are all wearing masks, and then it says New York, 2022. I'm like, oh,
Yeah, that's a trip. That's a trip. You know, I was just thinking as you were talking, so on the idea of an economy of life versus an economy of death, that made me think about, we've been talking about plants and you've been talking about farming, and there's a way in which, like, in the symbolic register, like, plant is more closely associated with the principle of life as such than
Mhm.
animal is, right? Because as Tomberg says in this chapter, like, the animal is a mixture of the mineral and the plant. And the plant is definitely like a pure principle of life, but the mineral is sort of an inert, dead principle. And symbolically, animals have always been associated with death.
Mm.
So
the tree of life and the holy living creatures.
yeah, but
Right.
this right, exactly, yes. And I think obviously, well, I think that, like, the living creature represents, like, the integration,
Yeah.
right, of all the elements of the different animal archetypes and the human and the angel, right? So it's like it's
Yeah.
the eagle and the lion and the bull and the angel and the man
Mhm, mhm.
all together.
There's a really cool book by Rudolf Steiner, which I used to have. I don't know what happened to it. It's called Man is Symphony of the Creative Word,
Right.
which is about, it's actually kind of extended lectures or meditations on the holy living creatures.
Gotcha.
Very
Gotcha.
cool. Very
Yeah.
cool. And about
Yeah.
our relationship to the animal kingdom.
Yeah. Very, very cool. Yeah, which is a lot of what Tomberg talks about earlier in this chapter too. There's something I wanted to share with you guys really quick, where he talks about the brain as the organ of mimicry.
Oh yeah.
So that
was good.
that which automatically made me start thinking of Rene Girard a little bit. But the brain is therefore an organ affecting mimicry, choosing what is going to mime, it mimes accordingly. Now relevant mimicry is precisely what the book of Genesis understands by cunning, when it says that the serpent was more cunning, Arum, than any other wild creature that the Lord God had made. Genesis 3, verse 1. It is, as it were, the psychological principle of the serpent. Just as enfoldment and movement in a closed circle is its dynamic principle, to be cunning is to mime wisdom.
Mhm.
And after having eliminated the essential, its light, and then to make use of it for one's own ends. This is why it is said that the devil is the ape of God,
Right.
that he apes God. Notice how there's, like, Sophia is what is eliminated, right? That, like, the wisdom is the first thing to go.
Yep.
The brain is therefore due to the serpent. It is the work of the serpent and mankind, as the animal species endowed with the most developed brain is certainly a granddaughter of the serpent. Human beings as cerebral brains are indeed children of the serpent, or children of darkness.
Mhm.
That's right.
Yeah, there was this made me to be cunning is to mine wisdom. Sorry, I keep referring to Job, but
Oh, that's
it's
okay.
in my head. You know, in the wisdom poem, it says to the awe of God is wisdom, and departing from evil is understanding.
Mhm.
And Tomberg has, I wrote a little side note, and I'm just trying to find it. He talks about revelation and operation. Do you remember that? Where is that now?
Oh, yes.
Oh, here. No, that's not it. I underlined it. I just got to find it. But that reminded me of kind of like what you're reading here about the cunning and the mimicry. To be cunning is.
I've got it, Sherry, if you want me
Oh,
to
okay.
do
Can
the
you
part
read
about.
that?
Yeah, the stages of the work of universal salvation constitute the spiritual history of mankind, which is the great universal Bible of which the historical Bible is a part. It can be summarized in two ways according to two different points of view. from the point of view of revelation and that of operation. According to the first point of view, mankind's spiritual history could be summarized as the Kabbalah does, by giving the various aspects of God that are revealed successively in the spiritual history of mankind. The 10 names of the God of the Kabbalah, which correspond to the 10 Sephiroth of the Sephiroth tree, represent a summary of mankind's spiritual history from the point of view of the gradual revelation of God. For from the aspect represented by the name Adonai to the aspect indicated by the name Aye, I am, there is a long road, the former being a term for the superiority of power, pure and simple, whilst the latter name signifies intuition of the being who is the essence of being, or he who is.
Yeah, so
Go ahead.
Well, what stands out to me here is the awe of God is wisdom, right? According to Job 28, and the departing from evil is understanding. So you have revelation, the awe of God. Job
Right.
says, I have seen you, right?
Well, that's like the first, that awe is the vision that results from from the initial hearing, right? That brings you to the beginning of the process of your becoming. So
Yeah,
your first experience of God is like what he's talking about in the Adonai sense here, through that experience of awe.
Yeah, but
The journey is toward the Aye, toward the I am.
right, which is a seeing. Okay.
Yes.
And that's what Job ends up saying. So all I'm trying to say here is that you have a procedural thing happening here. Like you start with revelation,
Mm-hmm.
and then you move to operation. That's what awe is wisdom,
Yeah.
and that imparts the departing from evil. Right. That's the operation.
Yeah, well, he explains the operation point of view in the next paragraph. He says,
Yeah.
according to the point of view of operation of the work of salvation, one could summarize mankind's spiritual history by describing its stages from the first opening of the closed circle of the serpent to the advent and blossoming of the reign of God within this circle. The stages in question, therefore, the opening of the closed circle, the path of exit, and the entrance to this door, and the incarnation of the Word. The first stage is that of the opening of the closed circle, makes way for the entrance of faith into incarnated mankind. The second brings hope. The third kindles love within it, which is the active presence of divine life at the heart of the circle of the serpent. All that mankind has been believing, had been hoping, has become reality in the present, and this is the essence of the whole spiritual history of mankind in a single phrase.
Right. And what he said at the very beginning was that all of that anything that enters within that closed system, that happens through birth, conception and birth, right? Which goes back to that.
Right, because first there has to be there has to be an opening. So like, yeah, he does say that like nativity is the first. Right.
Well, he
so
says that in that myth, right? Where's the myth? I gotta find it now. I just want to be sure I have this right. But woman guarded the memory of the world opened towards the Father in the Holy Sabbath, and she offered herself for the rending of the closed circle in herself in order to give birth to to children issuing from the world beyond it. Thus originated the suffering of her pregnancy, and thus originated sorrow on this side of the world.
Yeah, and there's a point where he connects like the opening, the exit, and the coming to dwell in the midst portions of that to like the cycles of the Christian year, where you have like the nativity representing the opening, the ascension representing the exit, and then the resurrection, the restoration, and the coming to dwell.
So then you have this, like he says further down, you have this enmity between the woman and the serpent, because she's opening the circle.
Right.
He's trying to close it.
Right.
Yep. Wants to keep it closed.
And but her opening it is through her pain.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Right. And also we mentioned earlier the cunning, right? And the intellectualization of things,
Right.
which and the pride that comes with that, thinking I can just figure everything out, for I am a scientist or whatever I am, right? And I think he points to the danger of that. And actually this kind of touches on the conversation Nate and I had with Peugeot a couple of weeks ago, or was it a month ago yet? That occultists or esotericists, and he asks, he said, how's he put it? It's kind of funny. Therefore, I ask, and I ask you, dear unknown friend, why occultist authors have not directed their zeal, fervor, and ability to serve the cause of the dove instead of that of the serpent?
Yeah.
And I
Right.
see my note from probably 20 years ago. I'm like, yeah, what's with that? But it's the
Right.
truth because
Right.
and you see the same thing in well, at least I do in literary studies, where the very much the going thing is to parade your intellect around. I'm finding
Yeah.
and you see this in theologians too, right? I have the most nuanced position on this. You think you're
Right.
anti-abortion? Let me show you real nuance about this.
So
Right.
really, to be
Right.
talented is to be a tightrope walker. Is that what you're saying?
Well, no, what I'm saying is, and I'm talking to a guy with a PhD. I'm not completely stupid, right?
I'm kidding.
But not completely anti-intellectual. But
no,
sociology for me is not an intellectual system,
no.
Right.
right? And I think for me, it's a way of being. It's an entrance into life. That's why it's so simple. People want
Right.
me to explain it like it's this big complicated thing.
Well, and
no, it's
Tomberg is
Thomas
not
Bernhardt.
Tomberg is not rejecting intellectuality either. He's just like he's rejecting intellectuality that sees itself as like the only path. Right?
Well,
So
intellectuality,
he invokes Matthew to be as wise as serpent.
but yeah, he is. But he's rejecting intellectuality as closed system,
correct.
Well, he says something
and that's
about
the whole
Correct.
point here. This is why,
which
this
is
what I
which is
think his
also the
method is.
principle of the serpent. He also ties like over and over again. He talks about like evolution, like the evolution on the horizontal plane, that struggle for existence. Evolution is tied to the serpent. So that would be the process of material evolution on the horizontal plane. Well, I would say, even though he doesn't explicitly say this, it's pretty clear from what he says about the dove following that the dove is the principle, is the opposing principle, the
So
principle that connects us to spiritual evolution, to the vertical.
And of course,
here, let me read this quick because this is from Tomberg. I am perplexed.
yep,
I
that's the next word.
I repeat, not because the interpretation of the serpent, according to the above mentioned occultist authors, is not true in what it essentially concerns, but because the subject of the serpent is treated by them with a strange exclusiveness, even partiality, that is difficult to explain by objective facts, referring to the problem as such, without recourse to psychological factors. And then down after the be wise as serpent and innocent as doves quote, he says, one should try to unite cerebral intellectuality with spiritual spontaneity. It is certainly necessary to think in articulated thought and in a discursive manner, but above this process of discursive thought, there always soars the ideal. It is in the light of the ideal that one should think. And I mean, I don't know about your experience in life, but I've always been kind of like, people are like, you're too idealistic.
Oh yeah,
They always say that to
I
me,
get it all the time,
right? It's so frustrating.
especially about my politics,
From who?
especially about everybody.
Huh.
Believe me, when you're the Christian anarchist in the room, no one likes you. Seriously.
I know.
Nate's been
So,
telling me I am an
they all
anarchist,
hate you.
but I don't know. I really haven't wrapped my head around that, so I don't know what that is.
They all hate you because you won't endorse their closed system.
Yep. Well,
That's why they hate you.
You're making me. I remember when we talked to Paul Vanderklay, he almost lost it when I talked about being a Christian anarchist. He's like, "Wait a minute,
Yeah.
hold it.
I
What?"
thought he was getting ganged up on because he already knew I was.
I think he was waiting for a spiritual pipe bomb or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
Spiritual pipe
Yeah.
bomb.
Catholic pipe bombs.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
Lord.
It's a very strange thing to be both a Catholic and a Christian anarchist, though.
Well, this made me happy about being called an idealist, because I thought, well, good, then there's a dove resting on me somewhere here,
Mhm.
and I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It also means that you have your eyes more on the ought than the is,
Yeah.
which is not a bad thing. How else do you think you bring it? There's no other way of bringing it to be in the world than to have your eyes on it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, this is what Peterson talks about with the looking up, right? Wishing on stars and all that kind of thing.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Peterson's good on that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I really related to that because I'm always wishing on stars.
Although his analysis of the image of the the Renaissance image of the woman crowned with stars was a little shallow and
I didn't.
didn't
Which one was
really-
that? Was that with the Verbeke and Peugeot video?
Yeah, he really was focused on this. He was focused on the serpents.
Yeah. Yeah.
He was
Dun, dun,
focused on the
dun.
serpent and didn't. He was focused on the. He
Interesting.
was focused on this role of the serpent, and that's the part of the image that he didn't really focus enough on the role of the woman. I don't think, from my perspective, that was in the Verbeke Peugeot conversation where he talked about that. Yeah.
Mhm.
So
I have
Yeah.
to watch.
he didn't have a sociological breakthrough there. Let's put it that way.
Well, I think they were working through something.
Oh
really.
yeah.
It was definitely like a working conversation. Figuring.
Oh, it was.
Well, yeah,
good-
that's a very butch paradigm. They're you know what I mean? That
Go
those
for it.
guys are excavating.
Oh
It's very masculine.
yes, it is.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
It is.
I mean, it's
It is
it's
very
not,
masculine.
It's not toxic masculinity. I don't know what that means, but it's
Yeah.
but it's very masculine, right?
Right.
And there's not, and I think that's probably
That's
a Calvinist thing, right? Because you know
this applies more to Peugeot and Peterson than it does to Vervaeke. I think Vervaeke. I think
not
is-
Vervaeke. I was thinking.
Yeah.
I was
Right,
thinking,
yeah, but Peugeot and
Van der
Peterson,
Kleef.
you're right, and that's why it surprises me because Peugeot gets so many other things right. That's like one thing where I strongly would disagree with him is the way when he did that talk on Dominion. Boy, did I think that was he just like way off base.
He gets well. I don't know what I'm pretty sure he probably grew up Roman Catholic. I'm guessing.
No,
No,
Baptist.
he didn't.
Did he really grow up Baptist?
Yeah, he was a Protestant.
in
Okay,
Quebec?
that explains it.
No,
No, it
actually,
does,
it does.
it
It
does.
does explain it. It does explain it.
Because I don't know if this is true. I've only watched so many of his things, but there seem, and I see this in my brother-in-law, whom I love, but he's a missionary Baptist, and he's kind of flirted around with more sacramental expressions of Christianity over the last decade or so. Is that he just can't get back past that Mary Sophia thing. I mean, he feels very attracted to it, but I think we got to put her in her place, though. You know what I mean? And I'm way past that. I'm like, man, I don't even care anymore.
Well, the thing is, just try to run a farm with no female animals.
I know.
Hello.
And you see,
That would
yeah,
be pretty rough.
Well, you would have no production.
that's right.
This is my point.
And all the dudes do is make trouble. Yeah,
Yeah,
right. Is it?
Yeah.
Oh, man.
yeah, and it would be Sodom and Gomorrah because
You know,
It
although
would
to,
be.
I mean, to be
Although
fair, I'm
it's
sure
like
if we
prison.
got,
Yeah.
I'm sure if we got, I'm sure if we got Peugeot into a conversation on that and to like interrogate whatever misgivings that we have, I'm sure that he would land at some place we were comfortable with because I just trust him as a person.
Oh,
Like,
yeah, but
he's
I
solid.
think there's I think there's a resistance in some spheres about the divine feminine.
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
because it
and
feels-
and within Christian spheres, especially, I don't have that, but most
Well, I had
Christians
to-
do.
I
Most
had
Christians
to-
do, right?
Yeah, like
I think even Karen Wong, I think she got a little freaked out when she talked to me. It's about what?
You know
what I mean?
Yeah.
I think it makes people feel who don't come from even a Catholic or Orthodox background where you sing hymns to the Virgin all the time and you pray the Rosary. It's just
Yeah.
kind of a cultural thing. I think it's easier for those people who grew up with that. And in fact, this is one of the things when I interviewed Margaret Barker, she said is she one thing she regrets is that she did not grow up in one of the Christian traditions that venerates the Virgin, because it would be more in her being, in her work, when she's talking about the Lady in the Temple.
Yeah, she's talked about how she wants to invite more Catholics and Orthodox to participate with her in what she's trying to do because she relies on their intuitions, having
Exactly.
been raised with that she just doesn't have, having come from a Methodist background.
Yeah, and I grew up on one of my favorite days at school when I was in Catholic school. It was when we did the May crowning,
Mm.
It was so cool. It was the church was full of all the kids brought flowers from their mother's gardens, and the church was full of flowers and children singing to the Virgin Mary. I mean, it's a wonderful, wonderful memory of mine.
Yeah.
Right. Which is a
But-
perfect segue to talk about the conversation, which I haven't had a chance to watch yet, but I'm guessing since you were talking about paganism to a certain extent, I'm sure that some of these themes came up in your conversation that you just
Yes,
recorded
they
with
did.
Roger Hutton. So
Ronald Hutton, but what a
Ronald
great
Hutton, excuse me,
guy. What a great
Yeah.
guy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, we talked about that quite a bit.
Okay. So
Okay.
check it out on
The
Michael's
Regeneration
channel, Generation
podcast.
Podcast.
That's right.
Any closing? We're coming close to the end of our scheduled time. Any
Yeah.
closing thoughts here?
I just wanted to read on page 255 because this is dear to my heart.
Go for it.
Who wrote this now? Can't remember.
Fabre d'Olivet.
Oh, Fabre d'Olivet, yeah. But if man is at first only a power in germ, which civilization must develop, whence will come to him the indispensable principles of this culture? I reply that it will be from the two powers to which he finds himself linked, and of which he must form the third. These two powers between which he finds himself placed are destiny and providence. Beneath him is destiny, natura naturata, necessitated nature. Above him is providence, natura naturans, free nature. He is himself, as kingdom of man, the mediatory will, the effective force placed between these two natures to serve them as a link, a means of communication, and to unite two actions, two movements, which would be incompatible without him.
And actually, those are also terms used to discuss Sophia.
Yeah, I know. I was thinking of Sophia the whole time I was reading.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which points to man as a mediator more than man as dominator.
Well, it's only through Sophia that man can mediate. So that's the thing.
Right. Right. Which is the, I think, and that's, yeah. Very good. Thank you, Sherry. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
I'll have
Yeah.
this posted sometime later today.
Okay.
All right.
Break through the circle, people.